I feel very deeply for the community of Port Arthur and for the people of Tasmania for what they have suffered. Out of that terrible tragedy, at the very least, the governments of Australia united in their determination to have tougher and more effective gun laws. I hope that the lessons of Port Arthur will not be forgotten on the Australian community, that there is a capacity for evil in our community, and we should always work as a nation to care for those who are the victims.
A young Tasmanian, Martin Bryant, was held to be responsible for the horrific events of April 1996. But who is Martin Bryant? Martin was born on the 17th of May 1967, and right from the start it was obvious he was not a normal child. It was soon realized that he needed remedial treatment, especially for his speech, and was sent to a speech therapist. He was eventually assessed as having an IQ of 66, and one of his school teachers claimed he was the clumsiest child she had ever taught. He was later to receive an invalid pension. When he was 26 years old, his father committed suicide, and as a result of that event and of a car accident in which he was a passenger, he inherited roughly $500,000. Although able to operate passively well in society, he was not really aware of the larger events in his life. He later inherited a house from his employer and managed to live independently of his mother, Carleen, who visited him daily and cleaned up his home. He made various trips overseas using some of his inheritance and seemed to enjoy traveling. He was generally held to be quiet, courteous, and happy in his own way.
Petra Wilmot was the last person to get close to Martin Bryant. A shy country girl, she applied for a job as his part-time gardener. She became his full-time girlfriend. He was her first boyfriend. Why did you fall in love with him?
Probably because he was gentle and kind and he'd look after me.
I believe he was often regarded as something of a simpleton, nicknamed Simple Marty.
Psychiatrist Ian Sale analysed Bryant.
He probably never had a real friendship. He didn't seem to be able to read other people's emotional and social behaviour correctly.
I kind of thought that the baddies were good and everything like that. He was a bit weird. Like he was like a young child. Like when he just thought that like the baddies were really cool.
These children used to play with Martin Bryant, their next door neighbour. They'd go over to his house and he gave them gifts: a TV for Ben 1, a doll for Evelina, and a CD player for Asher.
Because Asher said with the CD, "Oh, that's cool," and he goes, "Oh, you can have it if you like."
And then we saw another one that was better, and he goes, "Oh, you can have that one if you want."
I think he was lonely.
The Coopers became friendly with Bryant, who they thought was immature but harmless.
It was all gentle and didn't say anything to hurt you.
Yeah, and you'd never think that he hurt anyone or anything like that, because he just was really nice to everyone.
But just what was it that this inept and clumsy young man was accused of?
But first, a scene of horror and carnage in the Tasmanian town of Port Arthur tonight, where as many as 25 people have been shot dead in Australia's worst massacre. At least 15 people are wounded, and the gunman, who's still holding police at bay, is thought to be holding at least one person hostage. Most of the victims are reported to be tourists visiting the historic penal colony at Port Arthur.
Helicopters began ferrying the injured to Hobart from Port Arthur after a gunman opened fire there this afternoon.
We've had a gunman run amok on the Port Arthur historic site. That's 85 k's from Hobart. It happened mid-afternoon. There are at least 12 confirmed dead, if not 22. There's a further 15 injured. At the moment we have a hostage-to-siege situation which we're attempting to contain and control.
The convict ruins are a favourite with interstate and overseas tourists. It's understood those visitors have made up the bulk of those killed or wounded. Locals near the site cringed in fear inside their shops and homes as the gunman opened fire.
Police arrest the gunman. Now the questions. Why did he do it? And why was he allowed such a deadly weapon?
Good evening everyone and welcome back to this special one-hour edition of 790 News, incorporating Today Tonight, live from Port Arthur. Later a full bulletin of local and world news with Anne Forward. But first, no words can express the horror and disbelief in this little Tasmanian tourist centre tonight. Port Arthur has become a town of crisis, of wounded crowded into hospitals, of police desperately trying to piece the massacre together, and of families shattered by tragedy.
Less than 36 hours after the gunman went on an indiscriminate rampage, the death toll stands at 35. The worst massacre by a single civilian in world history. The killer himself is in hospital with some of his victims. He was captured, his clothes ablaze as he ran from a burning building.
The horrific massacre at the historic penal settlement began without warning.
He heard the gunshots.
Having murdered 32 unsuspecting local residents and tourists, the snipers stopped at a bed and breakfast lodge 5 kilometres north of the convict settlement and took 3 hostages, a couple in their 70s and a man who was earlier forced into the boot of a BMW and driven to the guest house. That car was later gutted by fire. Inside the Seascape Lodge, the man, armed with several high-powered rifles, continued firing at police, who were trying to negotiate by phone.
Our principle at the moment is to keep the house isolated and the people in it contained within the site, and we're hoping to open negotiations again. They've broken down because of some technical problems. A battery, I understand, and a phone that he had in the house ran out.
Has power to the house.
It's as simple as that.
Victorian Special Operations Group police flew in to surround the house, where they lay in wait until dawn.
That's a pretty...
Then, at 8 this morning, police were taken aback when they saw the Seascape Lodge burst into flames.
The upstairs portion of it is on fire, and there are flames coming from partly down on the lower level, on part of it. It's starting to slowly spread, I understand. There are still shots being fired, so at this stage I've given instructions that none of our personnel are to approach the house.
30 minutes after the fire began, the gunman himself walked out of the cottage, his own clothes on fire. He was immediately arrested by heavily armed Special Operations Police.
The person has been taken into police custody, conveyed to the Royal Albert Hospital, suffering from burns, no gunshot wounds.
The killer was taken by ambulance to a Hobart hospital. Under police guard, his head covered. He was wheeled into casualty and will face court as soon as his doctors allow. For 2 hours today, police escorted us to see the results of the killer's rampage. The house where his 3 hostages died was still smouldering. Having arrested the gunman, aged in his late 20s, police soon realised there were no survivors in the house. It burnt to the ground, leaving only the chimney and iron veranda post standing. The 3 hostages who died inside the cottage take the unbelievable death toll to 35, Australia's worst shooting massacre.
I think carnage is the simple way to describe it. It's probably the only single word that I know that would describe what was experienced in there.
The tourist region will reopen to the public in the next few days. The sudden and appalling slaughter now added to the region's already dark history. At Port Arthur, Dean Allen Craig, 790 News.
It was here as the gunman drove out of the park that he shot dead a mother and her 2 children, sisters aged 3 and 6.
Police came across the body of a woman and her 3-year-old daughter lying on the roadway, and the body of the 6-year-old daughter was behind the tree. It's our understanding that the mother was carrying the 3-year-old baby when they were both shot, and the 6-year-old ran away trying to escape and was shot in the process.
The children's father later arrived distraught at the police command post. By now, police and other emergency services were on their way to the scene, treating the many wounded as best they could and trying to limit the carnage.
It's horrendous, catastrophic. It's just beyond even thinking about, particularly anywhere, not let alone Tasmania.
But more blood would be spilled. At the toll gate marking the entrance to the park, Bloodied blankets mark the spots where 4 men died, apparently shot for their BMW, after the gunman abandoned his yellow Volvo on the side of the road.
Everyone's just devastated.
I suppose everyone has lost a friend, I suppose, in this.
Everyone knows everyone on the Petition.
By now, police had begun evacuating the area, including this crowded restaurant 10 minutes away.
Well, we had a call about 2:30 saying that there was a gunman going rampage and had shot at that stage 25 people who was coming our way, and for us to stay away from our windows and to be aware of what was happening. So we actually had to call our 30 people we had in the restaurant at that stage, let them know what was happening, and most of them rushed upstairs into the house and in terrible fright and up the back into the bushes. It was quite a horrific experience.
One more person would die. In Port Arthur, a woman leaving the general store shot through the front windscreen of her car. The 29-year-old gunman then drove to the Seascape bed and breakfast to play out the final chapter in his grisly saga.
These are the things that Martin Bryant was accused of. But have the media and government given the Australian people all the facts about Port Arthur?
To find out, let us listen to what the witnesses had to say.
One survivor in Royal Hobart Hospital has had a warming message from his 9-year-old son in England.
I love him really much and I want to see him.
9-year-old Gareth Collier found out his father had been shot after seeing his picture in a newspaper.
My dad with all these things around his neck and he's laying down in bed with all blood around his face and his ambulance is like got him.
Gareth hopes to leave for Australia soon to visit his injured father.
Graham Derek Collier, in his police statement, stated, "When I was sitting down, I remember seeing this person enter the cafe. He came through the doors on my right. I noticed him because of his overcoat. I think it was green. It was a type of colour you don't see that often. That's why it stuck in my mind. I saw him carrying a long bag. It didn't seem unusual, because all backpackers have long bags. He seemed to be somewhere about 20. He had long, blonde, bedraggled hair, about 3 to 4 inches below the shoulder. He looked like he might have had a lot of acne, a pitted face."
Everyone who knew Martin Bryant agreed he had a flawless complexion.
My wife Elizabeth and I were both employees at Port Arthur Historic Site Management Authority and were both working there the day of the massacre. My wife Elizabeth was murdered inside the gift shop section of the Broad Arrow Cafe, one of 20 victims murdered thereabouts. I know that Martin Bryant was not the gunman at the massacre at Port Arthur. How do I know? The coroner, Mr. Ian Matheson, wrote a letter to a number of survivors of the massacre informing us that Martin Bryant was not the gunman at Port Arthur. In the letter dated the 31st of January 1997, the coroner, Mr. Matheson, wrote, "As a result of the outcome of the charges against Martin Bryant in the Supreme Court of Tasmania, I write to advise I do not intend to resume the inquest that I opened on the 29th of April 1996. I believe it is not in the interests of the family, friends or witnesses to again traverse the factual situation in a public hearing, particularly when any finding I make must not be inconsistent with the decision of the Supreme Court." Well, I thought long and hard about this statement and discussed the point with friends. You must understand that there were many other facts of the shootings inside the Broad Arrow Cafe that begged a proper, open investigation, including workplace safety issues, and especially the issue of the emergency exit, that were totally outside the issues of the gunman. It was the simple fact that the coroner, Mr. Ian Matheson, believed that he could not make any finding that was inconsistent with the findings of the Hobart Supreme Court. That really stirred me. The Supreme Court can only make the finding of either guilty or not guilty in the matter brought before it. It follows that for Mr. Ian Matheson's inquest into the massacre at Port Arthur to make a finding inconsistent with the Hobart Supreme Court, then the finding could have only been Martin Bryant was not guilty of the charges brought before him. For the coroner, Mr. Ian Matheson, to arrive at the decision not to resume the inquest into the death of the 35 people that were murdered at Port Arthur, the massacre due to this reason, which he himself provided, then the coroner must have been aware that Martin Bryant was not guilty of the serious offences which produced 72 charges against police brought against him that day.
Tonight, victims call for a royal commission into the Port Arthur massacre. Alison Hembrough with ABC News. There's growing support from victims of the Port Arthur massacre for a royal commission or public inquiry into the shootings. They're disappointed an inquest into the tragedy has been abandoned, claiming many issues remain unresolved. These include concerns over security at the site and the issue of a locked door, which they claim may have cost lives. Despite a lengthy court process which led to Martin Bryant being jailed for the rest of his life, some of his victims claim there's still much to be resolved about that day. Wendy Skerr was a tour guide at the site, one of the first to begin treating the dead and wounded in the Broad Arrow Cafe. She believes a locked door in the adjacent souvenir shop cost lives.
If that door would have opened, I believe that at least 7 people that died in there would have had time to have got out.
Wendy Skerr is one of a growing number of Port Arthur victims calling for an inquest into the tragedy to be reopened. Stephen Howard is another. He lost his wife in the cafe. He's particularly concerned about security at the site.
There is no security at Port Arthur at this very present time, day or night.
2 weeks ago, the state coroner decided not to resume the inquest into the massacre. His decision, backed by the government, was based on the fact that Martin Bryant had pleaded guilty and the belief that survivors and families of victims would not want another raking over of the coals. For many, that's a very understandable reaction. But the coroner's decision has prompted a bitter response from 2 people who were closely involved on that day. Stephen Howard, whose wife was killed in the Broad Arrow Cafe, and Wendy Skerr, a former tour guide who attended to the injured in the cafe, want evidence presented publicly which they believe will show some people could have survived the shooting if security and safety issues had been addressed earlier.
I was very disappointed and very upset about the fact that there was going to be no inquest. I believed a lot of questions will be left unanswered unless this decision is reversed. I believe a lot can be gained by having this inquest. So many family members were there that day that lost relatives or friends, other people that weren't as directly involved as some of us were. A lot of questions need to be answered about what happened that day, what could have been prevented that day. I believe the whole nation will support this issue. The gun lobbyists, I believe they will be very interested in backing it as well, as it was raised last week in the media that the government had $50 million to buy back the guns, but yet couldn't find the money to have this inquest.
And late this afternoon, I recorded this interview with Tasmanian Attorney General Ray Groom in response. Ray Groom, you backed the coroner's decision not to have a coronial inquiry on the grounds, I think, that it would distress families unnecessarily because Martin Bryant had pleaded guilty. How many families or victims themselves did you actually consult before you backed that decision?
I've had a lot of contact with many of the families involved, Kerry, and the victims, those who were wounded, and of course also the general community of the peninsula and around Tasmania. There's no doubt at all that the common feeling is that we should get on now with the healing process. I don't believe it's in the public interest of the people of our state and those concerned to have a long drawn out public inquiry into this matter when the facts are quite clear. I believe it would be very, very traumatic. The government has a firm view about that we do want to try and put it behind us, and The issue being on the front pages in the headlines day in, day out has not helped our state. It's been very damaging to our community in very many ways.
Well, Stephen Howard is one victim who lost his wife, and he's quite passionate and pleads for a coronial hearing because he believes that all the facts haven't been laid out on the table.
I've not heard directly from Stephen. I've met Stephen. I know Stephen. I've had discussions with him. He hasn't put that view directly to me.
Mr. Groom's remarks seem strangely at variance to the reply Stephen Howard received from Mr. Groom, which read in part, "I regret that I cannot accede to your request. I have considered these reasons in determining that it is inappropriate to require an inquest or further inquire into the death of Mrs. Howard. The legal obligations upon a coroner do not extend to the matters which you have raised in your letter." The media handling of the events at Port Arthur could only be described as reprehensible. For instance, this picture appeared on the front page of the Tasmanian Mercury newspaper 2 days after the event. It could have influenced witnesses and ensured a fair trial for Martin Bryant was impossible.
By Tuesday, the newspapers had pictures. Murdoch's Hobart Mercury treated their picture in a most extraordinary way, unfolding their tabloid format into a broadsheet front page.
This is the man.
Our Tasmanian audience has his face obscured, but not the Mercury's readers. In a facile and futile attempt to avoid being in contempt of court by prejudging the man's guilt in Tasmania, where he'll be prosecuted, the Mercury explained the picture thus.
This is the man whom Tasmanians want to face 35 murder charges.
This is the man who allegedly...
Did they think that loan allegedly protected them?
Who allegedly, calmly, chillingly, coolly and brutally stalked and gunned down men, women and children.
This man is Martin Bryant, 28, a man of mystery from the Hobart suburb of Newtown.
All three Murdoch papers distributed in Tasmania, the Mercury, Herald Sun and the Australian, showed the man's face. No doubt gambling that identification would not be an issue in any prosecution and, dare I suggest, assuming that the authorities would lack the courage to take on the most powerful media corporation on earth. As to that, we shall see. Launceston's Examiner had a better news picture, the man in custody and arriving at hospital, but
Mr. Bryant's face has been blacked out for legal reasons.
For the mainland audience, this is the picture as the Examiner could have run it, but didn't.
The DPP, Mr. Damien Bugg, QC, placed all media outlets on notice yesterday that he would pursue contempt action against any broadcaster or publication whose coverage of the tragedy prejudiced the trial of the alleged gunman.
And if pre-trial coverage by the media in some enthusiastic desire to disclose as much as possible to the public results in a person being deprived of a fair trial, I wouldn't call it a legal nicety at all.
Since then, the DPP has given notice of prosecutions of the Australian, the Mercury, the Age and the ABC. Meanwhile, the Courier Mail thought it had a bit of a scoop of its own, a picture from the Newtown High School's yearbook.
A young Martin Bryant at Newtown High School.
Only it wasn't.
The photograph was not of Martin Bryant, but of Michael Robert Bryant of Hobart,
who may not be prepared to settle for something as little as a one-sentence apology hidden between advertisements on page 2 3 days later. But there's more to be said about News Limited and that photograph. First, it was run by every one of Rupert's Australian prints, the Advertiser, the Herald Sun, the Telegraph, the Courier Mail, the NT News, the Hobart Mercury, and of course the Australian. And Tasmania can join us for the close-up.
In no paper was there any fiddling with the picture. The eyes were shown thus, except in the Australian. There, the whites were painted in and the pupils were darkened. Result, the eyes of a crazy killer. An enormous number of people spotted the enhancement, such a genteel euphemism, and Wednesday's Oz carried this explanation.
An attempt to remove shadow from the subject's face unintentionally led to the complete removal of colour from the whites of his eyes. No editorial instruction to alter the photograph was given.
We believe you, Mr. Kelly. Hundreds of thousands wouldn't. Paul Kelly didn't mention a botched attempt to remove shadows when he spoke to AM.
The treatment of the eyes was a mistake. It was done in the production process. The important point to make is that there was no editorial direction given. There was no editorial instruction given to change the eyes at all.
Researching this question for our own purposes produced a squeal of protest from the editor-in-chief at the Oz. Dear Mr. Salter, on 2 occasions this week we have had reports of Media Watch contacting staff on the Australian, or within the company, in relation to our publication of the photograph of the Port Arthur gunman. The Australian's boss then made a demand he would have laughed at if it were imposed on his journalists. I would request that if Media Watch has any queries, that it should approach myself or Mr. Schmidtke directly. Don't wait by the phone, Paul. When he was talking to Suzanne Smith from AM, there was a related question about that photograph that Kelly seemed reluctant to answer.
There have been claims that the photograph was obtained from Martin Bryant's house. Is that correct? Do you wish to answer that, Mr. Kelly?
Well, the Australian obtained the photograph from the Hobart Mercury.
Would you please answer the question?
Did members of News Limited staff, though, enter Mr. Bryant's house to obtain that photo?
Certainly, nobody from the Australian did.
So you're saying someone from the Hobart Mercury might have?
I don't know.
An uncharacteristic lack of curiosity for such a senior journalist. How did the Hobart Mercury get the photographs of Martin Bryant and hand them on to all those other Murdoch papers?
Doubts persisted over how the photographs, which appeared on Tuesday, had been acquired, the police public affairs manager, Mr. Jeff Easton, said.
He said he was unaware of any complaints of a break-in at Mr. Bryant's suburban Newtown house. Well, the occupant was otherwise engaged, wasn't he? But 2 journalists employed by the Mercury seemed terribly familiar with the interior of the house.
From the street, it offers no clues as to the identity of its inhabitant.
But Stuart Potter and Sue Bailey report that on closer examination, it reveals some details of Martin Bryant's lifestyle. Thereafter, it becomes obvious that Potter and Bailey have been through the place with a fine-tooth comb.
Display cabinets are cluttered with old dolls, figurines and trinkets. Figurines also sit on picture rails in the lounge room and entrance foyer.
The kitchen, too, like the rest of the house, is cluttered. Any photographs among the clutter? The Mercury's editor is Ian McCausland. May we ask you, Mr. McCausland, who obtained the photograph and from where? We've inquired of the police, and this is what Mr. Easton told us. One constable was on duty guarding the house, and that constable definitely did not give Potter or Bailey a guided tour of Bryant's house. Police suspect a 3rd person was involved. 2 people distracted or otherwise engaged the constable, while a 3rd party entered the house. McCausland's paper, indeed every Murdoch paper, has managed to ignore the story about their photographs. The Canberra Times, a non-Murdoch paper.
Photographs of alleged Port Arthur gunman Martin Bryant that appeared in the media had not been officially issued, Tasmanian police said yesterday.
And the Examiner? They may well have been obtained by other means,
a spokesman said.
So a couple of unanswered questions remain. But there's no question about a certain Fairfax editor. I refer, of course, to Peter Cullen, who rejoices in the title of Editor-in-Chief, albeit of the Illawarra Mercury. His column on Saturday was headed,
"Nothing but a bullet for Bryant."
And what followed was the sort of thing you'd hear from a lonely drunk in the corner of a public bar, raving to himself as everyone else shrank away from him. Our system of justice demands a trial for Bryant. Why? It's called the rule of law, Mr. Cullen. We know you're not much impressed with it.
What more do they need to prove his guilt?
Due process and the consequent satisfaction that justice had been done.
It's a strange society in which we live. A madman kills 35 people and then society goes out of its way to make sure all his rights and privileges are observed for a fair trial. Sickening, isn't it?
Cullen is a powerful argument against foreign ownership of Fairfax. Surely Conrad Black doesn't know he has an editor like that? Good night, Tim.
At 12:30 p.m, two young ladies stalled their van outside Seascape due to an overheated engine. Whilst both girls sat in the car waiting for the motor to cool down, a yellow Volvo pulled up behind them. The driver got out and spoke to the girls, and at one stage asked them if they had any marijuana to sell, which the girls then produced a sachet and sold it to the gunman for $50, which he paid for with a $50 note. The driver then told the girls that he was going to the Isle of the Dead to kill some wasps. When the girls tried to leave the van would not start, so that this person then again reached into the van around the battery, said, "Here's your problem, you have a loose terminal." Fixed the leads to the battery, the van started and the girls took off. This person was not Martin Bryant. Martin Bryant does not smoke, nor does he partake in marijuana. Martin Bryant does not understand the electrical systems of motor cars. And thirdly, how would Martin Bryant know that two busloads of American tourists, derogatively called wasps, would have arrived at the Port Arthur historic site at approximately 12:30 p.m. so that they could board the ferry, the Bundina, to go to the Isle of the Dead at 1:30 p.m.
He said, there's a lot of wasps around today, there's not many Japs here, are there? And then started muttering to himself, and then walked inside, and that's when all the gunshots started going off.
It was unbelievable.
At 10:40 a.m, two neighbours, Andrew and Lynn Simmons, were at their driveway, waiting for a car to arrive, when they heard two shots emanating from Seascape Cottage. It was these two shots, heard at 10:40 a.m, that killed David Martin. However, at this time, Martin Bryant is drinking coffee at the Shell service station at Fawcett, as per the witness Gary King. Martin Bryant was 58 kilometres away when David Martin was murdered. During the siege of Seascape Cottage, a police negotiator, Sergeant Terry McCarthy, established communications with Martin Bryant, who was calling himself Jamie. Sergeant Terry McCarthy stated it was his belief that Martin Bryant was speaking from some sort of a script. Sergeant McCarthy also established that Martin Bryant had an accomplice, who Martin called Rick. At times it appeared as though Rick was running the show, and it also became rather obvious that Martin Bryant knew Rick quite well. There were over 20 times recorded in the police transcript that shots were fired from another room at Seascape Cottage, whilst Martin Bryant was talking with the police negotiator. The gunman firing those shots could only have been Rick.
You're now hearing for the first time the voice of Martin Bryant taped by police when Bryant locked himself in the Seascape Cottage immediately after his murderous rampage at Port Arthur. And Terry McCarthy was the only negotiator to speak to Bryant for the next 12 hours.
Was there anyone hurt?
Well, I understand there's been a number of people hurt at Port Arthur.
Oh, they weren't killed.
Well, I don't know the full details. I know that somebody's been shooting at people down at Port Arthur. I expected him to be in a highly agitated, aggressive state, or alternatively, sort of coming down and coming to terms or reality as to what he had just done. But he didn't fit either of those sort of stereotypical ideas that I had, and he was quite calm, collected, a childlike, effeminate sort of voice, and we were straight into a conversation. Bizarre. It was quite bizarre. I want to assure myself that everybody in there is okay. Are they all okay at the moment?
Well, I've been given a cup of tea.
You gave them a cup of tea. Where are they at the moment?
I can't see that.
Well, okay. They're okay. I take it nobody's been harmed.
I'm on a double bed at the present.
Right. Nobody's been harmed?
No one's been harmed. I'm making up some sandwiches. These people have got salad and bacon in them.
Right.
I'm going to fry up bacon and eggs for them.
At 0600 hours, the local fire brigade was put on standby at the Fox and Hounds Hotel. This was, to use Superintendent Bob Fielding's own words, as per the formulated plans for the resolution of the incident. At 0747 hours, Seascape Cottage was reported to be on fire. This fire was ignited by a flare fired by Sergeant Andrew Mark Fogarty of the Tasmania Police Special Operations Group. Superintendent Bob Fielding stated that at that stage he didn't know whether the hostage, Glenn Pearce, was still in the boot of the burnt BMW or within the house at Seascape. In other words, this is an admission that Rick could not have been the hostage, Glenn Pearce. Superintendent Bob Fielding was also loath to send in the Special Operations Group as he feared there could have been a 30% casualty rate. Superintendent Fielding was prepared to let the hostages burn alive rather than risk any police lives. At 0824 hours, Martin Bryant emerged from Seascape Cottage, dressed in black, with his clothes on fire.
The concerns for me in the decision making I had to go through was I was very mindful of the fact that there was possibly 3 people in the house. I had to decide were they alive? If they were alive, did I allow them to be burnt alive or to be consumed in the fire? Did I send the SOG in? The immediate action plan that had been presented me with a very difficult decision, because their estimate of casualties was in excess of 30%, which is a huge number of police officers to lose in an assault. So I had to balance up the advice I was getting as to the likelihood of the people still being in, the hostages still being alive, or risking the lives of further people to an effect an arrest and maybe rescue the hostages in a burning house. At the end of the day, I'm satisfied that we made the right decision in fact waiting and forcing him to come to us as opposed to vice versa.
At 0835 hours, Martin Bryant was arrested by the Tasmania Police Special Operations Group. This arrest took 11 minutes in a siege situation by one of Australia's highest trained anti-terrorist squads, leaving no chance of any possible hostage to be rescued.
Jamie.
Yes, hello, how are you?
I'm very well, thanks, Jamie. Yourself?
Well, I'm well up till now, in the past few 20 seconds. What I've actually found out, man, is that one of your boys is right outside, north-east, I'd say, with an infrared scope. Can you just ask him to move on?
All right, we'll do that. We'll do that now.
He's going to shoot, he's trying to shoot, he's going to shoot your main man.
I can guarantee...
I'll blow these... You know what's going to happen is...
I don't want to see anybody hurt, alright? Okay, I'm organising that now. So I can also assure you that it's not our intention to hurt you or see anybody else hurt, okay?
Really?
This weapon's a 223 caliber Colt self-loading rifle, model AR-15. This was the weapon that was used in the cafe where 20 people died. This particular gun fires a bullet at around about 3,200 feet per second.
Ballistics expert Sergeant Gerald Dutton is now custodian of Martin Bryant's collection.
It's a self-loading shotgun. Operates, which that means every time you pull the trigger there's a shot fired. This was found in the boot of his vehicle with a loaded magazine, holds 10 cartridges.
According to the police evidence, the weapons used at the Port Arthur massacre was a Colt AR-15 and an FN-FAL rifle. However, witnesses state emphatically that a shotgun was also used inside the Broad Arrow Cafe. Martin Bryant owned 3 weapons. He owned a Colt AR-10 rifle, a Colt AR-15 and a Daewoo shotgun. The FN-FAL rifle, which police evidence states caused the death of 8 people, can in no way be connected with Martin Bryant. Of Martin Bryant's weapons, the Colt AR-10 was in the possession of the gun dealer Terry Hill of Hobart. Of the Daewoo shotgun, Martin Bryant stated quite emphatically in his police interview that he had never fired the shotgun because it frightened him. And lastly, the final point to be made is of the murder weapons, even though Martin Bryant did own 3 firearms, there is no proof that those firearms were actually connected with Martin Bryant.
Well, I know a number of people were shot in the arms and legs, and there's some gunshot wounds to the head, and just about any part of the body you wish to name, we found some pellets.
On the 24th of April 1994, the Hobart Supreme Court found that Martin Bryant was incompetent to handle his own affairs. This set the legal precedent that Martin Bryant was held by the Hobart Supreme Court to be incompetent to make any plea. On the 31st of October 1996, the Hobart Supreme Court accepted a guilty plea from Martin Bryant on the authority of Professor Paul E. Mullen. What must be considered here is that any court, once a person has been found incompetent to plead, can only accept a plea of not guilty. In regard to Martin Bryant, there must be a full and proper trial, this has been totally denied to Martin Bryant. What would a full and proper trial have uncovered from the police evidence? In the police interview of Martin Bryant by Inspector Ross Payne and John Warren at Risdon Prison on the 4th of July 1996 and presented to the Hobart Supreme Court on the 20th of November 1996, what must be noted is that the Hobart Supreme Court on the 24th of April 1994 found that Martin Bryant was incompetent to handle his own affairs and placed him under the guardianship of perpetual trustees. In any legal matter, Martin Bryant must be represented by his guardianship perpetual trustees or by his solicitor, at this time Lieutenant Colonel David Gunson. In any police interview, once the interviewee raises the question of legal representation, the interview must stop and the required proper legal representation must be present before the interview can be continued. If this procedure is not adhered to, then the interview becomes inadmissible in any court, as per Justice Lionel Murphy of the High Court of Australia. Now what this means is that once Inspector Ross Payne ignored Martin Bryant's request for his lawyer to be present, the whole interview becomes inadmissible.
David Gunson has represented Bryant since his first appearance in May. In a brief statement to the media today, Mr Gunson confirmed he'll no longer be handling the case, but refused to give reasons for his decision.
Though Bryant's trust is refusing to comment, it's believed it's paying for his defence counsel and contacted Mr Avery to replace David Gunson. Mr Avery's second meeting with Bryant tomorrow will decide his future with the case.
John Avery met with Bryant at the prison hospital yesterday morning, just hours after Bryant pleaded not guilty to 72 charges relating to the shootings. While Mr Avery says he'll need to go through the case papers before making a final decision, he's more likely than not to appear for Bryant at a brief mention hearing set down for Friday.
Meantime, a bill designed to seize the assets of Martin Bryant has been introduced to State Parliament. Bryant is understood to have assets worth about $1.5 million, including a house and a trust fund. The legislation would allow the Supreme Court to freeze the assets of anyone charged with a serious offence. On conviction, their property would be sold, the money given to victims.
The legislation is designed to protect the rights of victims who have suffered at the hands of an offender or an alleged offender.
Once passed, the legislation will be the first of its kind in Australia.
Mrs. Carleen Bryant's solicitor was Mr. John Avery. In October 1996, Mrs. Bryant was persuaded by John Avery to assist in making her son change his plea from not guilty to guilty. This demonstrates a conflict of interest in the duties of Mr. John Avery. The Hobart gun dealer, Mr. Terry Hill's solicitor, was again Mr. John Avery. On the 6th of June 1996, John Avery wrote a letter to his client, Mr. Terry Hill, that is extremely telling. In the second paragraph, this letter becomes quite obvious that Mr. John Avery is representing Mr. Terry Hill in a matter that is detrimental to Martin Bryant. The third paragraph tells us that we had Mr. John Avery and Inspector Ross Payne conspiring to coerce Mr. Terry Hill to give evidence against Martin Bryant. In the fourth paragraph, here we have an offer of indemnity by the DPP, Mr. Damien Bugg QC, should Terry Hill give the required evidence against Martin Bryant. Paragraph 5. Here we have the threat of prosecution should Terry Hill refuse to comply with the wishes of Inspector Ross Payne and the DPP, Mr. Damien Bugg QC. And Mr. John Avery accepts this felonious behaviour towards his client. In the sixth paragraph, Mr. John Avery is telling his client to consider very carefully his position in accepting this felonious proposition. That Mr. John Avery wrote this letter to his client demonstrates Avery's preparedness to assist police in the coercion of his client. This letter demonstrates John Avery's animosity towards Martin Bryant. What we are seeing here is Mr. John Avery colluding with police and the DPP on the 6th of June 1996 to bring about the conviction of Martin Bryant. Terry Hill refused to commit perjury and was subsequently put out of business by the Tasmania Police in the latter part of June 1996. Terry Hill was never charged with supplying weapons to Martin Bryant. In the committal hearing at the Hobart Supreme Court on the 30th of September 1996, Martin Bryant pleaded not guilty to the 72 charges relating to the Port Arthur massacre. His solicitor, Lieutenant Colonel David Gunson, subsequently stepped aside and Mr. John Avery then started acting for Martin Bryant. John Avery was still also acting for Mrs. Carleen Bryant and Mr. Terry Hill at this time. What we have here are major conflicts of interest in the part of Mr. John Avery. Mr. John Avery represented Martin Bryant from that time until the finalisation of Martin Bryant's sentencing in November 1996. In September 1997, Mr. John Avery explained in a speech at the law school of the University of Tasmania how he was able to cause Martin Bryant to change his plea from not guilty to guilty on the 7th of November 1996. John Avery said it took 14 or 15 visits. John Avery said it was more of a matter of talking with the individual. John Avery also said he was the sort of individual who wasn't going to respond to simply being told what to do, which is where Lieutenant Colonel David Gunson failed in his duties. John Avery said, "I felt intensely that I had to do right by the community as well." In respect to client privilege, Mr. John Avery hoped he would be free of this obligation so that he could release his tapes to the media. There can be no doubt that Martin Bryant was totally betrayed by the Tasmanian judicial system.
We've been doing a lot of talking over the last few weeks, and I'm gratified as to the fact the right decision's now been made. 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 The fact the right decision's now been made.
Martin Bryant, a man of limited mental capabilities, languishes in Risdon prison without a friend and abandoned by the legal profession. He has never faced a trial and was induced by his defense lawyer to plead guilty after he had continually denied his involvement. His trial and conviction was accomplished in the media. There are so many anomalies surrounding this case that have never been properly dealt with, and the political will to bring these anomalies to a close has been sadly lacking.
What did you know? How much did you know? And when did you know? Why did you lie? Do you ever cry? Look us all in the eye. We went off to fight 'cause we thought it was right. We were trying to do the right thing as the fires of war had been fanned. You had nothing to say as they blew us away. Men were dying. As you tallied the score, boys marched off to a war that was planned. What guided your way? Was it power and pay? Is that all that mattered? As your plans were deployed, many lives were destroyed, and families were shattered. We trusted in you, and the things that you do would protect our way of life. How could we know that you served another? And when you saw our pain, you just did it again. Yes, you turned the knife while you smiled in our face and convinced us that you were our brother. Nothing to say as they blew us away. Men were dying. As you tallied the score, boys marched off to a war that was planned. And when you saw our pain, you just did it again. Yes, you turned the knife while you smiled in our face and convinced us that you were our brother. There will soon come a day, there's a price you will pay for all your betrayals. You can snicker and smile, at least for a while, but justice prevails. Yes, your life is replete with these days of deceit, but God never fails. God never fails. God never fails. God never fails. God